Martin took us to one of the poorest villages in Kenya. And I remember seeing kids coming to school in this village we were at, and there were hundreds of them, but they were not coming to go to school. They were coming because they were going to get a meal that day. And I remember it got to lunchtime, and there was a line of literally hundreds of kids, all standing, waiting with a little bowl in their hand, a plastic bowl in their hand, that they would get some food in, and they were all lined up. And I remember I walked from the end of this line all the way to the front of the line to see what these kids were waiting to get. And all these kids were getting for lunch, which they were happy to receive, was a small little bowl of corn. And I remember seeing that, thinking, that's not good enough. And to me, that line of kids was a picture of both spiritual need and physical need. And to see how over time, Possibilities Africa has addressed those needs is a work of God.
The smells just attack you because human waste just running in open little streams kind of thing along these little shanties. Tons of children, and you just think of the disease that's in there, the waste that's flowing, but also, not meaning to paint it all gloomy doomy, there were many small little churches in there, and a school or several, I think, just very small. It's a vast area. You can walk and walk and walk. And the warmth of people to welcome us. You are welcome. For those that spoke English to us as Americans, you are welcome. I'm like, wow, this is incredible. A student comes up to me named Josh Betts, Josh went on that initial trip that we did. He goes, "Doc, do you know Martin?" And we had done the roll call where I'd probably done the names Martin, Simiyu, but I go, "No, I don't." And Josh goes, "Doc, Martin's got this huge youth group in Nairobi, Kenya. You've got to get to know him, So literally after that class ended, I was like, "Hey, Martin, like Josh is saying you're kind of a thing." And Martin, of course, in his humility would never acknowledge that.
Martin read about Moody Bible Institute. He flew to Chicago. He applied for a scholarship. He met Matt Shada,
Doug and Farrell's son, and they became good friends. And in fact, Martin called Doug and Farrell his adopted parents.
He came with very little other than a deep calling on his life.
When Martin came, I was just inspired by him and invited him to come to my classroom. And I invited other classes to come in, so the room was packed, and Doug Shada came as well. But Martin talked about growing up in a village and learning to read and write and do math in the dirt with a stick because he had no paper or pencils.
A lot of Moody students come, they really don't quite know what's next in their life. They kind of know they need to study the Bible. Where Martin had such a clear directive on his life that God wanted him to return to Africa and to help, raise up his people in a way that they would take real self-sufficiency on their own. And I remember being just deeply impressed by that. I had a lot of students over the years. Martin just seemed to be a cut above in a clear sense of the why he was there. We formed a team, but really it was Martin leading in to really give some thought to planning the whole thing. So it would have been probably June of '02, I guess. I think Martin's heart was to get them out of the seats, so to speak, into the streets, There we went right into that. And, that changes your life. I had been exposed to some of that stuff, but a lot of the students had not. And you're wandering around through places like that, and the sights and the smells and the sounds and the vastness of it, that had profound impact on our team. And the delight of Martin was just exposing the students to that. And he just was wired into these, wanting us to see different ways that his people, so to speak, were either thriving or not thriving, or so desperately needed, the gospel to really take root deeply in their life. And Martin, he was able to articulate so beautifully the why that we were there, that it's like Africans for Africa, not just outside in effort, that rather it was time for the people themselves to take ownership and responsibility. And then I did see too how much he had a heart for the villages. And that's where you saw the real poverty too. It's one thing to see some of this in the big city, but there was resources to care for them. And I began to see in Martin that his burden was in some of these little villages where you just thought, man, there is so little here for people.
When we heard the vision, and based on some of the students who were over there during that trip, it was compelling. It was unlike anything that I had heard about in the past, and I had been exposed to quite a few missions organizations.
We knew that this was going to be a thing, and that it needed to become a thing even after we got back. Matt, of course, and Merrill were the two that were by far the most that walked with Martin in those next years.
I went to Steadfast Bible Fellowship in Omaha right after college, and they were planning a mission trip to Africa.
In 2006, we took a group of 16 of us to Kenya, and I think we were the first church to take a group to partner with Possibilities Africa. And I would say that after that trip, God established in my heart, and I think a few other people's hearts, that I can't see what I've just seen and not be a part of this.
We started dating, and like a few months after I had gone to Africa, and so that's all I wanted to talk about when we first started dating, was my time there. And so, yeah.
And I didn't really want to talk about missions. I wasn't very excited about foreign missions. I think in business terms. And frankly, I thought the church wasted a lot of money on foreign missions. When I looked at missionaries, I would see missionaries go overseas, produce almost no fruit for a while as they sit and learn the culture and try to learn the language. Then they would subsequently burn out quickly. And I thought people were basically throwing their money down the drain, supporting that kind of a missionary model. So Jamie was talking about missions. I wasn't really too interested in talking about missions. But then I remember hearing Martin Simiyu speak, and Jamie explaining the model to me, and I began to understand, hey, this is a lot different from what I'm normally hearing, because it is local people. Martin is a native Kenyan who already knows the language, already is immersed in the culture, and that's going to work a whole lot better than sending Americans over to Africa to try to change them. It'd be better to do it from within. And so it was more, not just economically efficient, but just, in my opinion, far more effective.
Doug Shada, who is no longer with us. He was our pastor, but he also was a very good friend. And we trusted Doug. He said, it's gonna go. And then we saw it. He had us go to Africa in 2010. And we saw it. And that convinced us even more to start supporting them.
We were back in 2012. In 2015 we were back, and then the last time we were back is in 2020. And we have seen a lot of water under the bridge over there. We like the how much could happen with a relatively small amount of money. We hadn't heard that in missions too much. So we thought this has got to be a good plan for God to go across Africa.
Ministry at its best is always incarnational. And that, the Word became flesh. Christ himself made his home in our midst. There was an incarnational framework in Martin from the jump.
Well, I think the basic premise here that we're trying to change lives, we're bringing people to Christ, and that will change all of these countries. It'll change the continent. And who better to do it than an African pastor working with African pastors? He understands the culture totally. He's been in their shoes, and we don't know that. So I think the role the Americans play in this is the best one of giving our wealth that we can to them and let him go.
He was ready to go. And he was smart and had good vision. So he was a leg up. He was the right man for this job. It became very obvious. And the money that was spent over there would go so far. The return on investment, I'm a business person, was extremely high. A lot of people came to know who God was. A lot of people were improving their lot in life. They could sustain themselves, even though it was still very basic. There's no sense running over there with fancy equipment and fancy buildings. They didn't need that. They didn't want that.
We saw so many cases over there, and I've been over there apart from Possibilities Africa as well. So many times that people were given, the people there, given items, clothing, maybe build them a church, but there was nothing past that, and so there was no way for them to grow or to learn. This was something that's ongoing, and the old adage that don't give them a fish, but teach them how to fish is just very appropriate here.
Business to me can and should be a noble venture because it provides so many things. And obviously when you connect that with ministry and encourage people to understand that can be real in their life and they can be productive and they can be a source of value in their community, well, I think that's really important. So that's a big part of Possibilities Africa as far as what's attractive to us.
I've just been amazed at the expansion and the impact that they're having on communities. And that is just so fulfilling to see how the Possibilities of Africa team are working together for good and following, I think, God's directive for the ministry.
We were there in 2009. We were in just 3 communities in 1 country in Kenya. And today that's multiplied up to 7 countries, Possibilities Africa. It's 7 countries in their area, and there's more than 50 countries in Africa. So there's still a long ways to grow. And my prayer is that Possibilities Africa would have operations in every single country across Africa in my lifetime.
I think that it's expanded geographically, but also in depth, in people's hearts, and the number of people being changed because of this.
One of my mentors used to say, a ministry that costs nothing accomplishes nothing. And no one will ever fully know the cost of the ministry from Martin's perspective, but we have to understand that very early on, most of the people didn't want anything to do with Possibilities Africa because they weren't offering handouts. And most people had been trained to receive handouts all their lives. And it wasn't until Martin gained traction with a couple of families who decided to buy into some of what PA was teaching, and the fruit of that was unmistakable. And pretty soon, all the neighbors started to see, what is going on with this family or that family? And then they wanted to be a part of it too. They wanted to be a part of the program. But that took a while, and that took a lot of people saying, Martin had to hear no, and probably you're crazy a lot. And so one of the things that I commend Martin for is his perseverance and his willingness to stick with it in the midst of uncertainty, in the midst of opposition, in the midst of hard times.
Could have been easier if he'd stayed in the States, that's for sure, but he went the way that he felt God was leading him.
I mean, he really has given his entire life to this vision.
Everybody needs to know who Jesus Christ is, and getting the word out to Africa or wherever any ministry is at is vitally important. And Possibilities Africa is the one that, really speaks to me, that they are out there in Africa hitting as many countries as they can to get the word out.
A few years back, I was reading a book by Dave Ramsey talking about legacy. And in that, he said that you need to be really diligent in the missions you support. Just don't write a check. You need to understand where that money goes and how it's used. Is it being used for the people that it's supporting, or how exactly does that work? And so when, just as I got to know more about PA and that, Martin's emphasis that there are no handouts, that the pastors have to buy in, to the program, was just, to me, I think it is one of the most worthy missions I've been associated with.
What we would enjoy seeing in ministries would be, is Christ enough? And certainly that's true of Possibilities Africa.